Hello, I'm Marian Arrowsmith, and welcome to our show. Today we have with us Dr. Clea Parker. Dr. Parker is from St. Tammany. He was a teacher here, a principal, a supervisor, went on to be president of Southeastern University, and we're delighted to have him here with us to hear some of his stories.
Pleased to be with you. It's always a pleasure to come home.
Oh, great. Well, we're glad to have you. One of the things I've been hearing from people who've been watching the shows is one of the things they really like is hearing stories about what it was like to grow up in St. Tammany 40, 50 years or so ago. And I know you grew up here, and I'm sure you have some very fond memories, and we'd love for you to share some of those. What was it like to be a child in St. Tammany?
I do have some very, very fond memories of my years at Mandeville and my years at Mandeville Elementary School. I started elementary school here in 1933, I believe, and Miss Coffey was the first grade teacher at that time. We had combination grades. It was first and second grade, and in all my years in elementary school, I was in a combination grade, first and second and third, and then third and fourth and fifth and fifth and sixth. So we didn't have enough students in one class to make a full class. I guess there were a little over 200 students in Mandeville High School at that time, and that was grades 1 through 12.
Wow. And how did you get to school?
We walked, or either our parents on a rainy day, we would ride our bicycles as we got older and could afford a bicycle. We rode bicycles, but the children in town could not ride the buses. There were only there was one bus, and it ran two routes during the years, my elementary years. We had a bus going on the Abita Road out in that direction, and then Lewisburg, but that was the only bus we had. And then later on, they brought in a bus to bring the Lacombe area students, the Highway 190 students from the east in. So we had three routes and two buses. And later, that was true really through most of my years, even as principal of the school in later years.
So that was a big area that came into the Mandeville
Yes.
School.
Mr. Minette, who lived just across the street here, that big white house, was they call him Judge Minette. He was a constable, I believe, or no, a city judge. And he owned the school bus, and his son drove the school bus, and his son was the janitor of the school. Elliot was the janitor, but Judge Minette living I guess the Minettes may still own that home right across the street. And Mandeville was a very small school, and in later years, that's down the road a little bit, but in about 1951 or 52 or 53, there were a group of parents who wanted to close the Mandeville High School and move the high school grades to Covington. Well, that split the community, as you know, and they went back and forth. So in 1953, I believe it was 53.
You were principal then of Mandeville High?
I was still in Slidell at the time, but it was 53, 54, I believe, that Mr. Pitcher called me one Saturday afternoon, and the school was to open the following Monday. And he said, Clea, our principal has resigned, and Mr. Mayfield, who was our supervisor of instruction and the right arm from Mr. Pitcher, and Mr. Doby, T.L. Doby, who was a school board member, had gotten together, and they had decided, I was teaching at that time at Slidell, and had everything ready to open school for that year for 54, 55. And so Mr. Pitcher said, meet me at Lacombe and we'll talk about it. So we met at Lacombe, and we went over everything, and I said, Mr. Pitcher, I went to elementary school and high school in Mandeville, and I'm only 26 years of age. I don't know if I can handle it or not. And so he said, well, I tell you what, we talked for about 2 hours, and he said, call me tonight at 7 o'clock. By that time, it was about 5:30. He said, call me at 7 and let me know whether you will accept or not. So I went back home and had just gotten married a few months before, and talked to Peggy, my wife, and I said, you know, I really don't know what to do. She said, do what you want to do. And we talked, and I said, I believe I'll try it. And so help me, this is what I was told. I said, Mandeville High School at that time, Mandeville School, was a problem school of St. Tammany Parish. I said, I'll take it, and if I make it, well, then I'll stay in education, and if it doesn't work out, I'll get another profession. So I called Mr. Pitcher and told him, and I stayed here then as principal for 7 years, and each year got better. It really did. From my first year here, I was 53, 54, yeah, because I left in 1960, 7 years later. And the first year was tough. It was really difficult. The first week of school, for example, people who I'd known all of my life in Mandeville, 4 boys, there was one rule I set up at the beginning that we didn't deviate. You do not leave the school ground without permission. If you do, you're automatically suspended for 3 days. 3 of the boys got in a car and they left and went to get them an ice cream. Well, they came back and I happened to know that they were gone, so I waited for them and they finally came on, got out of the car, and the bell had rung at after 1 o'clock after lunch. And I said, boys, come on to the office. And so I sat them down. I said, you all know what the rule is. You're suspended for 3 days. Call your parents. And these were parents, as I say, since these kids were infants, I had known them. So they were shocked that their sons were suspended for 3 days. But it's probably one of the first decisions that I made that really showed the people, the parents, that I might be young, and but I was going to run the school. And you had to do that in those days. You had to have discipline, which you have to have today, and of course we don't have good enough discipline in a lot of places. But anyway, they served their 3-day suspension, came back, and about a week or 10 days later, another good thing happened to me. That same group of boys, with about 8 or 10 others, came to me and they said, Mr. Parker, we know you've coached basketball at Rugby Academy and at Lee Road Junior High School and Slidell Grammar. And so would you mind coaching us? They had dropped basketball the year before, discontinued. They wanted to have a basketball team. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. Make a bargain with you. They said, what is that? I said, you all help me with this school, improve it, and I will coach the basketball team. They said, that's a deal. Those boys helped me paint in the gymnasium, which the old building is still here. We painted the restrooms, we replaced windows, and they worked with me. I let them use the gymnasium on the weekends. One of them, whoever I gave the key to on Saturday afternoon, I'd say, now you're responsible. And they accepted the responsibility, and the kids worked with me. And really, as I say, the school just improved from each year it became better and better. And at the end of my last 4 years at Mandeville High School was really the last 5 or 6 was a real joy. The first year, as I said, was it was tough, but it worked out very well. I've had people tell me that was the beginning of the real development of Mandeville schools.
And Mr. Pitcher was the superintendent at the time.
Mr. Pitcher, that's another story in itself. Mr. Pitcher was the superintendent. Mr. Mayfield, Mr. Brock, and I were the 3 general supervisors. And Mr. Mayfield, it was understood, was a senior supervisor, general supervisor. And we didn't have a special class, a special group. We were supervisor in grades 1 through 12, agriculture, math, science, you name it, and we visited all the teachers and all the grades in the entire parish. And that's probably one of the best experiences that I could have had. And of course, having been at Mandeville High School, where it was grades 1 through 12, and I visited teachers in all grades, in all subjects. When I became a general supervisor, I had teachers tell me, well, Clea, how do you know this? I said, well, remember I was at Mandeville School when we had that subject and that grade, and it was just all grades and all subjects. And that was tremendous training for me to become a general supervisor. And but for when I moved into the office, in fact, we had a special supervisor in education and in special education, Ms. Armitage, and we had a supervisor of music, Miss Hermione McNeely, and we had a speech therapist, and the three of us and Mr. Pitcher there. That was Mr. Pitcher had a couple of secretaries. Mr. Mayfield and I shared a secretary, and Mr. Brock, the three of us, and we only had professional people, about 8 or 9 people in the entire parish that ran the whole system.
When you said this was Mandeville High School, but it was 1 through 12.
They had the titles in, yeah, it was grades 1 through 12, Mandeville High School, but it was grades 1 through 12. I went through the first grade through it was grades 1 through 11 in those years. That was 1 through 11. We only had 11 grades when I was a student here, but then when I became principal, they changed, I think, that in the late 40s. They added the 12th grade.
And actually, the building was right where we're sitting today.
Where we're sitting here would probably be where the first grade students would have been in that old building. I have a picture, by the way. I brought one of my Mandeville yearbooks from Mandeville High School, and it has, see, this was the Mandeville High School at that time.
Okay.
And that's the way it looked. It was a fine old building. They had 4 rooms at each end, on upstairs and downstairs, and 4. So they had 8 classrooms, as I recall. No, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yeah, 8. And they had a small classroom in the middle, and then the lobby was right in the bottom. That was
Looks a lot like the Shane central office, the old school up in Covington.
It was shaped a lot like it, yeah.
Looks a lot
But
like that.
there was actually 4 large classroom buildings in rooms in the entire building.
And I believe our superintendent, Gil Sloan,
Gail
attended
was
while you were
graduated, is a graduate of Mandeville High School, and she was a student in the first grade when I was principal here. And in fact, in that annual, we were looking for her picture a few minutes ago, and we found it. I think she was in the 4th or 5th grade.
5th grade, I believe.
In the 1960 annual.
We'll have to show that to our audience if we can. So, okay, you mentioned that you were, the boys asked you to do basketball. What other kinds of sports or extracurricular activities were available to the students then?
Well, in Mandeville in those years, Mandeville High School was the only place where you could really participate in recreational programs. And basketball, Mandeville High School was such a small school that the only sport we participated in playing other schools was basketball. So really, when school opened in September, we started playing in the gym, playing basketball, and we played basketball some throughout the year. Now, we had, of course, the health and PE classes and health and PE teachers. And also, just a little bit to the east here, we had before we had the gymnasium built. That was built in 1940. But we had 2 basketball courts in the yard, and one of them was for the girls and one for the boys. Now, I remember the girls even both of them had rocks and everything else. So, but that's where we played basketball against other grammar school teams and high school teams on those dirt courts until 1940. But when they had the gymnasium built in 1940, that was a great thing.
Who were some of the superintendents that were in St. Tammany during your time here?
Mr. Pitcher was the only superintendent that I had during my tenure as a student or as a teacher and as a coach. In my 17 years, Mr. Pitcher was the superintendent. Prior to that, I remember, now as a student, I remember Mr. Lyon was still the superintendent. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Mr. Pitcher was superintendent during my 17 years of employment. We had a superintendent by the name of Elmer Lyon. In fact, Covington High School used to be called Line High School, and it was Mr. Line. And I remember he had I guess I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, and he had a little Model A Ford coupe, and it had a little rumble seat in the back. And when he had a few new books or things to deliver, he delivered those. That was a superintendent that was delivering the books and so forth to the schools.
And then after Mr. Pitcher?
After Mr. Pitcher, Sip Shane followed him.
Okay.
And I left, the year that Sip came in, I had moved to Nichols State College, Nichols, at Thibodeau in 1967. And I think Sip was appointed in the latter part of 67. And he was superintendent for, I think, about 20 years. He and I were about the same age. We worked together on a lot of projects, a lot of things. And there was a group of, where we were fortunate again as young teachers. There was a group probably of about 8 or 10 or 12. Troy Jackson, Sip Shane, Dick Clanton, Ronnie Pogue, and I know that I'm leaving Ralph Minitry. Mr. Mayfield took us under his wings. He was probably one of the most professional, respected supervisors undoubtedly in the state of Louisiana, and really was known nationally. But he encouraged us and he pushed us, and we all, every one of the group that he called them his boys, we became principals and supervisors. And that became the leadership in St. Tammany Parish, and had been for a number of years, people trained by Mr. Mayfield. He was, I tell people, well, in fact, when I left, and I felt the same way toward him, but when I had accepted the job at Nichols, I went into his office and told him that I was leaving. And he said, "Clea, I feel like I'm losing a son." And I said, "Well, I feel the same way. I feel like I'm losing a second father." And he treated all of us that way and encouraged us. He really motivated us and to do the very best we could.
Of course, then you ended up as president of Southeastern, and
yes.
What a wonderful connection we had between
and Mr. Mayfield, and he has had that type of effect on many, many people. One of the most professional people, and at that time, when I moved into the office as a supervisor, St. Tammany, I was fortunate during those years, even though there was just Mr. Mayfield, Mr. Brock, and I who handled the supervisory program, and we had the 2 specialists in special education and music. St. Tammany had probably one of the best supervisory programs in the state of Louisiana at that time. Now, East Baton Rouge was a step ahead of us because they had a little bit more money. And there were a few other parishes probably that were ahead of us. But
I believe you wrote about the history of the supervisor.
Yes, in fact, I have my thesis for my master's degree was a history of supervision in St. Tammany Parish. And you can see in here how it grew and how it improved and how it really, the things that we were doing, even though we didn't have a great deal of money, we did an awful lot of things to help the children of the parish.
As you look back at that time, what do you think of as some of your biggest challenges?
I graduated from Mandeville High School. I'll go back there. And I was one of the few people at that time who went on to college. And I remember I said, I don't know if I can make the grades. I don't know if I can make it at Southeastern. Well, I went through summer school, and in June of 45, I enrolled in summer school. And I went through summer school, and I made, I think, a couple of A's and a couple of B's. That's when we had 12 weeks of summer school. And I said, well, I know now Southeastern is going to be my home for the next 3 years. And in fact, I had to get out because, of course, I was paying pretty well most of my expenses. My dad and mother helped when they could. But in 2 years and 11 months, I had my degree from Southeastern. So wondering whether or not I could make the grades, I didn't have that self-confidence when I went to Southeastern.
But you obviously did it and went on and got your master's and then your doctorate.
And well, through the encouragement of so many people, Mr. Mayfield encouraged me with, as far as my doctorate, he encouraged me, he said, Clea, you really ought to go ahead and get your doctorate, and which I did. Then, as principal at Mandeville, you ask about problems. In my first year as principal, I had that same feeling. I didn't really know whether I would succeed or not as principal. I didn't know whether, I just didn't know. And those were just trying years, and we had some difficult days, and every now and then some students would get out of line a little bit more than others, and we had to discipline. But those were, my first year in Mandeville was a difficult year. Then the same thing, then I went to Southeastern, and of course I had worked so much with young people when I got to Southeastern that one thing that I did over there, I was out on the campus a lot, visiting with the students and having coffee in the cafeteria and maybe sitting down and having lunch with them. But I had been doing that at Mandeville High School for years, walking out on the school ground, visiting with the students. So this helped me. And the students at Southeastern then appreciated my being out there and visiting with them and talking with them. And so everything, through the years, I've had some rather serious problems, but thank goodness the good Lord has led me and He's directed me and taken care of me. And
Dr. Parker, what were some of the initiatives that during
one
your
of the
time?
ones that I recall, we were talking about technology earlier, and of course when I was a principal and a student at Mandeville, we didn't have very much equipment. In fact, technology amounted to the overhead projector. We did have those at the time, and the mimeograph machines. But in 1965, due to the growth of the MISU location, we had a tremendous number of people that moved into the parish, and it was called, as I recall, federally impacted program. And the first really large amount of money that St. Tammany ever received was in 1965, and we elected Mr. Mayfield and Mr. Pitcher and all of us sitting down together. We recommended that we build a teacher education center, which is still located, as I understand, and is still utilized out toward the Claiborne Hill area.
We call it the Educational Center now.
The Education Center. And that was the first teacher education center in the state of Louisiana at that time. There was one in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and another state, Arizona or New Mexico, one of those states had a teacher education center. And Mr. Mayfield and I visited, and had a couple of teachers go with us, visited 2 or 3 of those where they were, and it was very limited. And the new teacher education center, as I recall, would probably be the beginning of the growth of the technology program to what it is today in St. Tammany Parish. But that would probably have to be considered the beginning.
What kinds of things were done in that building?
Oh gosh, we employed a specialist in reading, and they had a classroom set up.
Now that was Isabel Yarborough, correct?
Isabel Yarborough, that's right. Wonderful lady. And she had classes in there to teach teachers how to teach reading. And of course, we also at that time, we purchased a mobile reading unit. It was a large, like a motorhome. And we had all the reading equipment in that mobile unit. They went from school to school, and that we got that just before I was leaving St. Tammany, so I really didn't get to observe too much of the work that was being done. But we had the mobile teaching unit, and then overhead projectors and typewriters and things like that. That day that was modern and up to date, we brought that equipment in. I think Jerry Cottrell was probably the first director, as I recall,
right.
of the Teacher Education Center.
And there was a library, a professional library?
Oh yeah, we developed a professional library, that's right. Teachers could come in there and they could work on their classroom work or work on their thesis or so forth, whatever they wanted to do. And of course their classroom work was number one, but there was all kinds of equipment in
And
that
Betty Gill
building.
was the librarian in there, I believe.
Betty Gill was the librarian.
Right.
Yeah.
Great lady. So you grew up in St. Tammany, went to school here, then became a teacher and taught in Slidell.
Well, going back after I graduated from college, I accepted a job in New Orleans at a small private school called Rugby Academy.
I remember that.
It was on St. Charles Avenue, and really prepared students to go, high school students to go to Tulane. It was kind of like an arm of Tulane. And I coached and taught 6 classes a day, and all my coaching was after school or on Saturdays. We didn't have any time during, well, the last period of the day. And I coached track, football, and basketball. I stayed there for 2 years. My starting salary my first year was $2,025. I got a raise the second year, $2,250. The third year, by that time, the state had set up a minimum salary schedule. And I decided that I would come to St. Tammany, and I went to Lee Road, and I think my first salary at Lee Road was about $2,900 per year. And by the way, that is probably 2 of the most enjoyable, I won't say best, because I had some awfully good years everywhere I went, but 2 of the most enjoyable years in my history, in all my years of teaching, was at Lee Road Consolidated School. We had a principal by the name of Mr. Ido Fitzgerald, just a real gentleman and a wonderful person, tremendous faculty. And then I was called back into service for the Korean conflict. And as I recall, that would have been in 1951, maybe 52, I guess. And when I went to I reported for duty at the Custom House in New Orleans, and they gave me another health examination. I had been discharged from the Coast Guard back in 1945, and they checked my hearing, which as a child, I had mumps, and the nerve in my left ear was destroyed, so I was completely deaf in my left ear. No one hardly ever knew that, because my right ear, it was so sharp. But anyway, I went back then after they sent me back home and said, we're not going to take you. So here I was, and it was in August without a job. So I headed to the school board office, and as a result, my job at Lee Road had been filled. So they said, we have one vacancy, well, we have a vacancy where you would fit in if you wanted at the Slidell Grammar School. So I went to Slidell Grammar School, and that was, at that time, it was through the 7th grade, grades 1 through 7. And I accepted a job there, coaching the boys' basketball team, the girls' basketball team, and I taught science. And by the way, it had 49 students in one science class and 47 in the other science class. So those students, I mean,
quite a difference from sizes of classes today.
But you know, we had no discipline problems. We just the kids worked hard, and it was a problem, but it really worked out very well. But anyway, from Slidell Grammar School then, that's when I mentioned about Mr. Pitcher calling me on the Saturday before school was opening in 1953. And
so you came here and you were principal
came to Mandeville
here.
as principal here. That's when I 26 years of age and serving as principal. And then I served principal at Mandeville High School from 1953 to 1960. And in 1960, as I indicated earlier, the board decided to hire another supervisor of instruction, and I was employed in 1960 as a supervisor, and I stayed in the central office then through 1960.